Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar from Real Story Group. Excuse me. This is an exciting topic for us today. We're going to get into web content management technology, which is where we get our start as a company. You know, Tony will often share how he started this company almost out of frustration back 23 years ago as he was implementing web content management systems and the reports he was reading at the time for these different vendors weren't aligning with his experiences with the technology, and I'm sure he'll touch on that today. So what we're really going to focus on is a little bit of future gazing when we talk about 2025, and is this the year of transformation for web content management? So stay tuned for that. It should be an exciting conversation today. For those that are new, welcome. We always leave time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions, feedback, or anecdotes you'd like to share, you can enter those into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will get to those at the end of today's session. And then the slides from today's session will also be sent over to you later this week, and a recording will be available for our subscribers. Once again, thank you for joining us today. And for those that haven't come across Real Story Group in the past, we're an industry analyst firm, right? But as I mentioned, you know, Tony, when he started this company, took on a different approach than some of the more traditional analyst firms that are out there, in the sense that we don't work for any of the vendors we cover in any way, shape, or form. Okay, so we don't speak at their conferences, we don't write white papers for them, we don't advise them on their strategy. We completely sit on the buyer side of the table to help you make the right technology choices for your differentiating requirements. And that's really fundamental to everything that we do. So keep that in mind, because we really pull no punches when talking to you about what these vendors do well, but probably more importantly, what they don't do well and where they might fall short for you. We cover a number of different vendors in a number of different marketplaces, and you'll see our map here, and Tony will get into that a little bit more detail. So Tony, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. You know, we cover 10 different marketing technologies, and these are all the vendors that we evaluate in a single graphic here that we use as a kind of a subway or a tube map, with each line representing a different technology. Today, we're going to be looking at the light blue line, which is web content and experience management. As Scott mentioned, this is a topic kind of near and dear to my heart, because I originally founded Real Story Group as CMS Watch. Web content management tools were the first tools that we evaluated back in 2001. Our first report had 12 vendors on it, some of which are still on this map today. And so it's something that I personally have been following, and as a company, we've been watching for more than 2 decades now, and it's really fascinating to watch this evolution. Certainly this industry has had its ups and downs. I do believe that 2025 represents a kind of a tipping point, and we'll describe in a little bit more detail just what that means shortly. So we always like to, when we're talking about the future, we like to start out with a brief history of web content management across the 3 decades that it's been around. We're going to talk about some tectonic changes that are roiling this marketplace. And specifically, what does this mean for you as the customer? Less about what it means for the vendors, but more, what does it mean for you as a customer and user of these technologies? And then what should you do about it in 2025? And we always end with some key takeaways. So in the early 2000s, this was our reference model when we first started CMS Watch for really, in a sense, kind of MarTech, where everything was based on your website. Your website hopefully ran on some sort of CMS, and it took all this source content and then pushed it out primarily as web pages, but also back in the day, there were the ability to publish PDF files and publish to what were then wireless devices and syndication. And so this was kind of a simple model for how, in a sense, your digital universe sort of existed at that time. And this was a model that we used quite frequently. Of course, over the course of the 2000s and into the 2010s, we saw the major expansion in terms of the digital channels, and then, of course, an expansion in the colored boxes here of the content and engagement management services that were available to actually leverage your content and leverage this interactivity across all of these different channels. where instead of just the WCM in green, we saw the rise of digital asset management, of course, marketing automation and ESPs, and then social engagement, whether organic or paid. And then a whole set of intermediary delivery services pushing out to these 6 important channels. Customer data still largely not part of the picture back then. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so this was an effective reference model. We used it for the 2010s. And many of us spent a lot of time really modernizing and getting strong in these 4 colored boxes, getting to the right vendors, building a lot of internal capacity. The problem is that we ended up building a lot of silos where content and data and logic was kind of trapped in these different environments, and increasingly, especially when it became evident during the pandemic, that we were struggling to really deliver coherent experiences, and we were struggling to integrate laterally across these different solutions. Now, in the 2010s, the industry came up with this sort of shorthand that they call the DXP, which was basically some big web content management vendors decided that they were no longer CMS vendors, that they would acquire all these other capabilities and call themselves a DXP, and also potentially push some content to your mobile application, and that made them, something nominally more robust. The reality is that among the DXP vendors, they still sell these as separate modules. They're still very disconnected, and they're still very much silos today. And so that model has really was reaching its limit towards the end of the 2010s, really got exposed during the pandemic. And now we have a new reference model for the 2020s. It's a MarTech reference architecture. This is the B2C version. There's a B2B version that changes slightly, where you have, again, at the top, proliferating engagement channels, canonical interaction and delivery environments, and then this first row of engagement services here, where web content management is now kind of one piece among many. And so that's important to understand, that many of your digital touchpoints and engagement of your customers are going to come through a set of other services, many of which are their own sort of applications. But what we're really seeing in the 2020s, and this is both something that's happening as well as we think an aspiration for really smart enterprises, is the rise of what we call enterprise foundation services. And those come in the form of content and information on the left, data services in the middle, and decisioning services. So these are things, that capabilities that very often were associated separately with these different engagement services, but now we need to decouple them or abstract them away from those so that we're able to then orchestrate these capabilities across different environments. So that we're not just doing personalization separately in our web content management system, we're having a coherent personalization strategy and capabilities across all of these different engagement services. That's just one example. And so also, of course, we see the rise of AI, generative AI, insights AI, and decisioning AI. So what all of this has done is, in relative terms, the scope of WCM across your whole stack has been reduced, right? Now, that doesn't mean that in absolute terms it's become less important, or that you shouldn't invest in it, but it now sort of has to, in a certain sense, really justify and compete against all these other sorts of capabilities that you need to bring to bear. And what's more, the smart company is going to decouple some key services from your WCM so that they aren't stuck in that silo. So this is what we often call a legless architecture. We've written a lot about that. We have other recorded webinars where you can go into more details, but this is just the context for what's happening, kind of setting up the scene now. For now, we're in the middle of the decade. This has been going on for some time. Larger enterprises in particular are well along this journey. We've helped nurture several of them along this journey. 16 of the Fortune 20s have gotten our advice in this regard. And so, we come by these observations honestly, I guess I'll say. So this architecture is loosely coupled. It's the only way to scale. It's the only way to get to omni-channel. It's the only way to be adaptive and to be able to plug in new engagement services and new channels. But so that in theory sounds great. In practice, what this means is pushing complexity, people, and budget lower in your enterprise, some degree of centralization here as well among MarTech teams. And so the converse to that, or one of the implications is that you have an opportunity to get simpler and more agile at the engagement tier. And we'll have a lot to say about that in a minute. But this is both a trend that we've been witnessing for the last 6 years and something that we have been counseling and advising, particularly large global enterprises on, really during the course of this decade. And we're seeing it accelerate as we go into the middle of the decade. So now let's talk about some tectonic changes that are related to this, but specific to Web CMS. There's really 4 major changes. I'm going to describe them now, and then we'll spend a little bit of time. We'll go back and talk about each one. So first of all, we have what we call a long march from sites to applications, or another way of putting this is a long march from information to services. Now, information and content remain critically important, whether it's B2B or B2C. I'm a former journalist, so I'll never say the content is unimportant. It's terribly important, but certainly your customers increasingly are coming to you in a digital way because they want to interact with you and do business with you, and certainly that's what you want as well. And so content becomes less of an end in itself and more of a kind of a lubricant or a means to an end. And the reality is that your informational websites are, with each passing year, comparatively less of your online footprint. So that's one major change. I think the second major change that, we've been banging the drum on this for the last 4 years. So if you've been in our webinars, you haven't heard anything new about this, but really headless WCM ended up being a kind of a non-answer to the dilemmas that we're facing. On the one hand, they're technically elegant in as much as they separate content production from content delivery and assembly, but they're also, it turns out that they're functionally limited. They're functionally limited in as much as there are use cases still for content managers to also be experience managers. In other words, there's times when you want to do page curation. And secondly, the headless web content management systems are also functionally limited in as much as they're primarily interested in supporting narrative, where other forms of content like images and data become kind of second-class citizens. So they're not, on the one hand, they are functionally limited. On the other hand, in terms of actual scope, they're not really reaching what we want. And it's been interesting watching the headless vendors start to build their own sort of heads and try to align more with digital asset management vendors. In general, this has not been an answer to the dilemma of what is happening in the WCM world. What is happening, we believe, and this is really accelerated over the last 3 years, is the rise of what we would call omni-channel content platforms. This is a spin-off from the digital asset management, or DAM marketplace. And this is foundation tier technology. So typically these platforms are not actually customer facing. It's where you manage component content, typically in a graph model that you're going to reuse and repurpose and measure across different channels. Talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, the other major change that's roiling every MarTech market is AI. When we think of WCM, we often think of generative AI. In RSG's vision, generative AI is actually probably going to be the least impactful of the 3 types of AI. Yeah, it's interesting to plug it into your WCM, and there's no reason not to do that. But the other changes are likely to be more foundational, and that also has some impact with respect to your WCM investment. The shorthand of saying this is that AI in general, and generative AI in particular, is not going to make WCM significantly more important in your stack. So let's talk about these. I think, with respect to traditional versus cloud-first headless CMS, the answer is in. People want both a page editor as well as a kind of a REST API on top of their content. There's pros and cons to both. I think the hybrid model has won. That debate in our mind is over. A large enterprise in particular needs both. So we see the headless vendors moving towards hybrid. We've seen the traditional vendors moving towards hybrid, and there's no need anymore to be religious about this. Here's a short list of pros and cons. You'll get a copy of this deck later. I'm not going to read this out. Again, we're just sort of reinforcing the point that hybrid is really where this is all at. So this issue that somehow a headless WCM is going to get us to this future of component content management is really kind of mythical. What we really need is moving towards what we would consider an omni-channel content platform. Let's talk about the rise of OCPs. So this ability to have component content that's reusable across any channel is increasingly important. This is also where you're going to have your most valuable content. This is also the store where you're going to then train your AI models against it. It is increasingly a precondition for customer-centered omni-channel experiences. Many organizations have shied away from these because these are complex to manage and run, and that's true, and it's as true today as it was yesterday. But as our needs and our capabilities rise, the scope of OCPs is really growing. We're seeing more and more of our subscribers begin to adopt them and do interesting things. The other thing that's driving this is the criticality of supporting all major types of content. So not just narrative, but also images and other media, and also data that represents as content. So this could be offers, pricing, all kinds of things that you have to reflect. It could be master data or campaign data that you have to reflect as content as well. You need a single place to manage all of that. And so what has arisen to address this is the OCP. These are 5 or 6 vendors that have spun off from the DAM space, where assets, text, data are all first-class objects, typically organized in a graph model that allows for arbitrary query and traversal of these assets, and then allows you to then track and measure their effectiveness. So if this sounds like nirvana, it probably isn't. It's in theory, it's nirvana. In practice, this is somewhat difficult to do, but enterprises that are really serious about this are moving in this direction. But what this also means is that it reduces the scope for web content management, in as much as you no longer need or want your core enterprise component content, whatever format it's in, to be stuck in a WCM silo. You want it to be managed at a lower tier so that it can be syndicated across any channel, including channels that haven't really emerged yet. So this is really the long-term model of where we're going, where you have this omni-channel content platform that has omni-channel content services, your digital asset management, potentially a syndicatable version of all of your product information and other things. It's reusable, trackable. You're publishing that out to various channels where, to be sure, it might be modified or configured for that channel. The parent-child relationships are sustained. This is where you're doing your most important translation management. There's still a role for the green box. There's still a role for web content management in this model, for longer form experiential content, value story content, certainly static page management or any kind of page level curation, and to that extent supporting websites in particular, maybe pushing some long form content to other places like a portal, distributors, potentially your commerce environment. But your WCM is less of a syndication environment and more of a long form content management environment. Your OCP increasingly is where the action is in terms of your high value content. So what about AI? There's at least 3 types of AI. We break the world down, into data, decisioning, and content. And so we have insights AI over data, decisioning AI over decisioning and personalization, and then generative AI over content. And there's a variety, there's about 15 different use cases that you can see underneath it. That's how we evaluate AI vendors. So you saw that one of the streams on our map was AI vendor technology. We evaluate about 24 AI vendors, and these are the use cases that we evaluate them against. Generative AI, you can see some interesting use cases. I think one of the more interesting ones is actually around operational productivity. Certainly a lot of us are focused on writing and editing, graphics and video and so forth. Given the proper guidelines to the right and the proper foundational capabilities below, yeah, you can plug some of these in to your WCM platform. Your WCM vendor may have this even pre-built. Ideally, they have a kind of plug-in capability so you can use your enterprise AI rather than the AI that they bring to the table. The AI that they bring to the table might be interesting to experiment on, but in the long run, you're probably going to want to manage this at an enterprise level and have the kind of guardrails that you see on the right in the blue there. So you're probably going to plug in your enterprise generative capabilities into the WCM platform. Again, it's this notion of Your WCM platform is more of a container where you're plugging in different enterprise services like personalization, AI, customer data, all of that, as opposed to your WCM platform being a decision maker itself, right? But the other story here, and so this is where RSG, I think, differs from a number of analysts, is that we see generative AI as more of a derivative function, more of a helper to insights and decisioning, and that what's going to be more transformational for MarTech is going to be Insights AI, which is going to uncover potential opportunities, and then Decisioning AI, which is going to tell us what to do with those opportunities, when and where to present what, and then a Generative AI to create the variance and to allow us to scale this in a really efficient way. So ideally, we get to this kind of flywheel that my colleague Apoorv has developed here that you see on the right, where this then becomes self-reinforcing. This looks really cool. In reality, it's quite difficult. It requires multiple different vendors, a lot of governance. You know, when something this potentially attractive, you know, it's also going to be difficult to pull off. What's interesting is we talked to our council about these use cases and their adoption level. And what was interesting is that and our council are mostly large enterprise players. And we asked them, what are you doing with AI today? And how mature are you? And so that's the charts on the right. And what's interesting is that they're kind of already taking to this as well. In other words, yeah, they're playing around with generative AI, but they're really excited about insights and decisioning AI. And that's where a lot more maturity is happening as well. So although you may hear a lot about generative AI, and I don't want to poo-poo it as not useful, it obviously has tactical usefulness. I think the more transformational things are happening on the insights and decisioning side. So what does this mean? I think, you know, the first thing is we need to take a really hard look at the WCM marketplace as a whole. You know, the marketplace, we call it the great squeeze. The marketplace is still highly fragmented, which is analyst speak for saying there's still a hell of a lot of viable vendors out there. Most of these have been around for 10, 15, some cases 20 years. But the marketplace is getting contracted. The high end of the marketplace has almost disappeared, and the low end of the marketplace has disappeared to site builders like Wix and Squarespace and so forth. Because the mature market, you can look at it as a complexity spectrum, where you have the most complex players, of which really only Adobe still survives as a toolkit. And I would argue that 80% of the licensees of Adobe don't really need it, don't really need a toolkit. And over the past several years, we've been counseling major enterprises about how to get out of the toolkit trap, but it's there as a toolkit. So if you're going to do something completely unique that no one else has done, you probably need some sort of development environment like Adobe to pull it off. Then you have some upper range platforms, very powerful for larger enterprises, maybe necessary, and then a wide range of mid-range players. There's still a lot of competition over usability, editorial models, to some extent architectural models. The head optional or hybrid model now is predominant. You know, I don't think that significant numbers of these vendors are going to go away. I do think, however, that they are all likely to get very squeezed. And more importantly for you is that you have an opportunity to reconsider just how much complexity do you want, and therefore the level of effort and cost and agility benefits of maybe going with simpler technology as you look at 2025. So in particular, I think we would say this about every engagement market, whether it's loyalty, email marketing, social engagement, web content management, even to some extent e-commerce, is that there's an opportunity to get simpler at the engagement tier, where instead of using some of these more complex platforms, you can look at somewhat simpler solutions, kind of from top to bottom in the box below, that may prove more apt for what you're needing. Among other things, less ongoing costs, simpler and faster adaptation. If you've externalized a number of services, maybe you don't need something that's super complicated anymore. This is really a good story for you because this frees up resources for, again, the other more complex parts of your stack, specifically if you're going to have omni-channel enterprise content at the enterprise, at the lower level, kind of foundational tier. So if you are thinking about selecting technology in WCM technology in 2025 or replacing, let's have a deeper conversation around that. We've written this book, The Right Way to Select Technology, based on our experience of 2 decades of helping organizations select technology. Many of the use cases from the book come from helping organizations with web content management technology. Happy to have a deeper conversation with you about that. And so if 2025 is the year that you're kind of rethinking your WCM footprint, let's chat some more. But in the meantime, let's summarize some key takeaways. Wanted to remind you that we'll definitely have time for questions, so feel free to put anything in the GoToWebinar questions tab, or we've already got a couple backed up here, which is great, but if you have anything else or just any comments you'd like to make, anything you disagree with, you agree with, feel free to put that in. We'll definitely have time to do that. Okay, so let's try to answer this question. Will 2025 be transformative for web content management? Yes, I think so, but maybe not in the way that you might have thought, which is we think that web content management is going to transform into something less, not something more, particularly in relation to the other digital investments you want to make. So the key thing for you going forward is to really consider about right sizing. And there's a lot of benefits that come to right sizing. You can push complexity. If you're pushing complexity and richness lower in your stack, that means you can get simpler at the WCM tier. And this is a good thing. You can spend fewer resources on bloated platforms and instead focus on better omni-channel customer experiences. You definitely want to be prepared to leverage AI. The first thing, or anyone really wants to get into AI, is to get your data house in order. Think about getting your content house in order with respect to having your omni-channel enterprise content being in a place where you can access it, protect it, and then leverage it. But then focus on generative from there. But think about generative in the context of the better decisioning that you're going to make upstream. Okay, so with that, I just wanted to summarize. There's 3 different ways that if you liked what you saw here and you want to engage with us further, there's 3 different ways you can do that. One, we can help you find the best fit vendor. So you just license our web content management stream. You get access to our advice, our tools, all of the down and dirty evaluations that we do. Second option is to do a full stack subscription. Many large enterprises do this with us, where they license all of our research and we help them make broader stack decisions. And then among the subset of organizations that have a full stack subscription, the third option is to join our enterprise MarTech Leadership Council. We just had a meeting this morning, a virtual meeting. It was awesome. It was around taking your CDP from MVP to full rollout. Fascinating conversation among very large enterprises. We're going to be meeting in person in Atlanta in the spring and also in London during the summer. So if you're interested in joining that, it's enterprises only, no vendors, no integrators, no suppliers. These are just buyers getting together. So if you are interested in any of those things, you can reach out to us and we're happy to have the conversation with you. While we take a quick look at the questions, Scott, you want to just talk about next steps?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tony. As Tony mentioned, you can always reach out to us at the coordinates here and we'll get right back to you. So whether you want to take a look at some of the research that we offer and the decision support tools that go with it, or interested in learning more about the council that Tony mentioned, we're always looking to see if there are a few folks out there that could be good fits for the group. So certainly reach out to us, and you can also download samples of the research anytime to really see the approach that we take in evaluating each of these different solutions. The next webinar we have will be in January. We're going to take a look at Adobe and the future of your MarTech stack. So that should certainly be an interesting conversation. And in terms of today's session, I do see a couple of questions have already come in from Steve and Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. The first question is from Steve. He's asking, in terms of scale, how are global companies able to achieve this if they don't rely on a large suite like Salesforce or Adobe? Well, if you're talking about WCM, Salesforce is really kind of a dead end there. If we're talking about Web CMS, nominally they have a package, it's not very good. You really, for Web CMS, you really don't need Adobe to scale globally. There's any number of other platforms that global organizations have successfully leveraged. Most of these platforms, the ones that are really surviving this market, have come out of Europe, where already they had to deal with multinational, multilingual, multi-site, all of that. And so, the scale comes more on the delivery side, and caching and being able to distribute this content globally is less and less of a WCM consideration. So this notion that because I'm big and global, I need to go with an Adobe, I would say is not true today, has not been true for some time. Moreover, I'd say it's not just WCM where that's the case. I would say the same thing about email marketing, about CDPs, about everything else. You have many, many choices that can support global scale, regardless of the MarTech market, but especially in the WCM market. So Mark has a question. Do you see vendors, applications that have coupled OCP and WCM together in one system, or do you see them as separate vendor systems? They're definitely separate environments. And, there are some vendors that nominally say that they can do both. I think that you'll find that typically they're going to be better at one than the other. And these are very different systems with very different use cases. And so you'll need to think carefully about whether you do them from the same vendor. We have counseled some vendors, some licensees who have. They were very specific environments. Happy to have that kind of conversation with you offline, because it was very, very specific and I don't want to share confidential information. But these are, to a large extent, two separate marketplaces. So Eric is asking, you made the legacy vendors gray. Is that because they've all passed away? Some of them, Eric, have passed away. There's others that are basically in a retirement home on life support, like Tridian and Oracle and others. So those are platforms you leave. They're not platforms that you license afresh. So always good to see you, my old friend. And with that, thank you for staying. We're a couple minutes past the half hour. Always welcome this opportunity to interact with you. You can always, as Scott mentioned, happy to continue the conversation in any of these modes on the screen here. But in the meantime, for Scott Bill and myself, Tony Byrne, signing off for now. Bye now.